The world's elite chess players have gathered in Poland for the Superbet Rapid and Blitz, a thrilling 4-day tournament. The roster includes Indian superstar Praggnanandhaa, French super GMs Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Alireza Firouja, Bulgarian legend Veselin Topalov, and many others. Time controlled 25 minutes for each player, plus 10 seconds added for each move. Today we have day 2, and what a day it was! Stick around, you are for a treat. Let's take a look at the standings after 3 rounds. Vladimir Fedoseev is the sole leader, followed by Firouja and Indian superstar Praggnanandhaa. Now you can see the pairings, and we have a clash of 2 favorites, Firouja against Prag. And let's start with that game. Knight f3. Firouja starts with the move of the knight, d5, b3, to fianchetto the bishop on a square b2. This is Nakamura style of play. I prefer old style school with e4, d4 in the opening move, but this is how modern players play and nothing is wrong with it. c5, e3, knight f6, bishop b2. We have theory on the board, c4, exchange of the pawns on c4, bishop goes to g7, and now dark squares bishop for white has a counterpart in g7, bishop e2, castle, castle, b6. Praggnanandhaa is going to develop his light square bishop on a square b7, d3 for Firouja, bishop b7, queen c2, developing moves, knight jumps to the center of the board with knight e5, queen c7, and after queen takes c6 we have a battery on a long diagonal, and there is a checkmate on g2. Obviously Firouja doesn't blunder it and plays a very logical move, bishop f3, blocking that whole diagonal. Queen has to move away to c7, knight develops to d2, rook d8, and the whole theme of this game for black would be attacking a weak point on d3. It's very difficult for white to do anything with that pawn, and they would have to protect it pretty much the whole game. Exchange of the bishops on b7, but first intermediate move, knight g4. Not taking the bishop right away, but trying to checkmate an opponent with queen takes h2. Obviously white does not allow it, played knight f3, protecting the pawn on h2, bishop takes b2, exchange of the bishops, and queen takes b7. The opening phase of the game is over. Now we have a middle game. Position is pretty much even. The only target for black in this position is the pawn on d3, and this is basically how the game will continue. Rook d1 protecting that pawn. Black would like to double up the rooks on a d file to attack the pawn again. a4, doubling up on the rooks. Pawn on d3 is again under attack, and Firouja protects that pawn from the side with rook a3. a5, rook b3, knight f6, and here we have knight e5, hitting the queen on c6. Queen moves away, and Firouja now have a triple battery on the b file, attacking the pawn on b6. Knight d7 protects that pawn, and also asking the question whether Firouja would like to exchange the knights. Firouja says no, he goes to knight g4. Knight f6, knight e5, the moves are repeated, and knight f3. Firouja with this move shows that he is for the fight, he doesn't want to draw by repeating the moves, and continues the game. Rook c6, that moves opens up a square d6 for the queen, and queen d6, and again hitting the same pawn, poor pawn on d3. Queen c3 has to protect it again. Queen c7, some moves are repeated, and knight goes for a journey, possibly to a6 and b4. Queen e5. Firouja is asking, why don't we just exchange the queens and agree to a draw? Praggnanandhaa says no. Rook d6, let's continue the game. Queen g3, knight d7, queen moves back, knight moves back, knight f6, the knights are jumping, queen d8, and the pawn on d3 is again under attack, and it has to be protected. The move knight e5 not only protects the pawn on d3, but also hitting the rook on c6 that has to move away to c8, queen f4, queen c7, g4. And now the threat is g5 to attack the knight on f6, and if the knight moves away, then queen would take on f7, and white would win the game. Therefore, Praggnanandhaa sees it ahead of time and preemptively protects the pawn with rook f8. d4. Finally, this poor pawn from d3 was able to move. Exchange of the pawns on d4. According to the engine's position is still even, although visually white look a little better. Knight goes to d7 one more time. Not sure how many times Praggnanandhaa put his knight on d7 in this game, but obviously a lot. And finally, those knights are exchanged. Queen takes d7, d5. Some territorial advantage still for white, but black do not have any weaknesses in their position, and therefore this position considered to be even until Praggnanandhaa plays the move e6. And that's a mistake, because after rook takes b6, rook takes b6, rook takes b6, e takes d5, Firouja needed to find a move c5. And after c5, creating a passing pawn, his position would have been better. Instead, he just exchanged the pawns on d5, and now we have a queen and rook endgame, which is absolutely even. Rook b5, queen a8, important move because it has to protect the pawn on a5. h4, Firouja continues to play for a win with some ideas of attacking the king on the king side of the board. Rook e8, king h2, queen e4. And now Praggnanandhaa says, well, let's exchange the queens and just agree to a draw. And Firouja says no. He wants to exchange the queens, but on his own terms, to get the king into the game. And as we know in the endgames, active king is the king of endgames. Queen h1, queen f3, again offering the exchange of the queens. Now we have a couple of checks. Check, check, check. And instead of repeating the position and agreeing to a draw, Praggnanandhaa, again, in his aggressive style, continues to play for the win. He plays rook d8, and now the threat is rook d3. And rook d3 would win a queen, because it would be a pin and the queen would be lost. Rook b3, protecting the third row. Another check. And here comes rook d4. And the whole India is like, oh no, this is not good. This move immediately loses the game. Now, if Firouja just checked on b8 with the rook, king would go to g7, and we have an absolutely even position, and the game would still be a draw. But Firouja finds the best move in this position and winning move, and that winning move is a rook b7. Rook b7 attacking the pawn on f7. And as we can see, how do you protect that pawn with black pieces? There is really no way to protect it, but Praggnanandhaa finds a way to protect the pawn, checking the king. Queen f1 check, king h2, queen c4. The pawn on f7 is protected, and it seems like everything is fine. But here you can stop your video and find a move, and by the way, this is the only move that wins the game for white, and Firouja found this move. So I hope you found it too. The winning move for white is queen f6. Queen f6, and after this move, Praggnanandhaa resigned. The reason he resigned is because black have no checks. White king, although being absolutely wide open, is pretty safe here. And the checkmate is coming from a rook b8. Pretty much the only way to stop the checkmate is queen c8. But in that case, white would take the pawn on f7 and checkmate with queen g7 checkmate. Therefore, Praggnanandhaa cannot survive this endgame. He is going to be checkmated one way or the other, and Firouja won a very important game because Praggnanandhaa, and give him credit, he wanted to win, he wanted to play for the win, he didn't want to repeat the moves, but he went too far. Firouja won. Another game from this round I want to show you is between Bulgarian legend, former world champion Vasilin Topalov, against a young Indian grandmaster Aronian Chithambaram. Topalov starts with e4, and in this game we have a more old school style chess with Rui Lopez opening. Bishop goes to a4, all standard stuff, the oldest opening in the world, probably played for hundreds and hundreds of years. d4, immediately gaining center for white. Bishop goes to b6. It's not a good idea, by the way, to take this pawn on d4, because after taking on d4, white would have a tremendous center with those two pawns in the center, and black only have one counterpart. In this position, after bishop b6, black also have two pawns in the center, and that's much better for them. a4, bishop b7, and bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen. h6, asking the question where the bishop would go. Bishop just moves back to h4, b4 for Chithambaram, h3. Topalov pretty much ignores anything that's happening on the queen side of the board. B takes c3, b takes c3, and rook e8. d5. d5 is a mistake because it pretty much blocks the whole position, especially it blocks a light square bishop for white. And now that bishop becomes a very sad piece, and it's almost impossible to get this bishop into the game. Knight a5, bishop moves to a2, and really is out of the game for a long time. g5. Now black has a pretty big advantage, pretty much because white is playing without a piece. Also the knight on b1 still never entered the game. White's position is pretty sad. But here comes a knight takes g5. Topalov is always playing on the edge. So he sacrifices the knight and now has a very, very unpleasant pin on the knight on f6. Unfortunately for him, it doesn't really do him any good because there is only a bishop, a queen, and the rook that can join the attack on the black king, and those three pieces are standing around like a taxi in the parking lot waiting for the passengers who don't really come. Black pieces are all pretty much in the game. King g7 supporting the knight one more time, queen f3, and now both the king and the queen for black has to be glued to protecting that poor knight on f6. Rook goes to h8, knight finally develops to the square d2, and Chithambaram transferring his bishop to a more pleasant diagonal, because on this diagonal it was totally blocked. Knight f1, the knight goes to a square f5. King g6, what a move by Chithambaram. The king goes to the middle of the board, and that's actually the best move in this position, hitting the bishop on g5, and it turns out that the bishop has to be removed, or h4 as Topalov plays. But now after h4, the square on g4 becomes very weak. Rook h5, queen g3, and simply bishop d7. And discovery attacks on the king are not dangerous for black because the dark square bishop doesn't have really any good moves to jump away to check the black king. after any check, after any move of the bishop, the king would simply go back to h7, and black do not have any issues at all. The only thing that keeps white in this game is the pin. Rook e3. As you can see, that's a sacrifice of the rook by Topalov. Well, if you don't take that rook, then the rook would simply go to f3 and the knight on f6 would be lost. So therefore, Chithambaram accepts the sacrifice of the rook, and after knight takes e3, white is playing without a rook, which is nothing new for Topalov. He sacrificed a lot of pieces in his illustrious chess career, and his young Indian opponent has only 1 minute left on the clock. So Topalov is also playing on the clock here. He wants to put as much pressure on his opponent as possible. Knight e4. Very nice move by Chithambaram. Now he attacks the white queen, and after, if bishop took on d8, then knight would simply take on g3, and black's position is still weak. But Topalov finds a nice move, bishop b1, pinning that knight to the king, and white actually has some threats in this position. The best move for black in this situation is f5. But Chithambaram, with 50 seconds to go on the clock, takes the bishop on g5, and after pawn takes g5, queen takes g5, and the game becomes pretty much even. Bishop takes e4 with the check, now f5, bishop goes back, exchange of the queens on g3, and let's take a look at this position. We have even material all of a sudden. 5 pawns against 5 pawns, rook against rook, bishop and knight against bishop and knight counterparts. So the position all of a sudden is pretty even. The only thing works for black advantage is they have an active king, which is very important for endgames. We have more moves that are made, and here in this position black is already better because they have a pretty dangerous pawn on g3 that was under attack, and the rook from g8 is now supporting this pawn. More moves are made, and clearly here Topalov seems like he doesn't have many ideas because he is playing pretty passively with knight f1. Obviously knight e3 is the threat, forking the rook, but Indian grandmaster sees it and exchanges the rooks on b4 and plays a beautiful, brilliant move, king f4, sacrificing the knight on a5. The best way for white to continue this game was not to accept that sacrifice, but Topalov did. He took on a5, and after e4, just look at this position. White has an extra knight, but they don't have any moves. That's what's called zugzwang in chess. The pawns do not move by the rules of chess. The king is totally cramped at square g1, and the only move he can make is king h1, king g1, going back and forth, and the knight has only one move where it will not be captured, and that move would be knight d2. That's losing also. Topalov plays knight d2, e3, and it turns out that white simply cannot stop the pawn from promoting. The only way to do this is knight f3. So that stops the pawn at least for some time, but the position is totally lost. After e2, white resigned. White resigned because they really don't have any moves. Let's say king h1, then simply king e3, and let's say knight would go to e1, king would go to d2, knight f3, king d3, and after the check, king can just go to d4 and pretty much devour all these pawns, and white absolutely have nothing to do against it. Beautiful endgame technique by Indian Grandmaster, and he now has 5 points out of 8. Let's take a look at the standings after round 4. We have two leaders, Fedoseev and Firouja, and on the third place, and that's a bit of a surprise, Indian Grandmaster Aronian Chithambaram. Let's take a look also at the pairings for the next round, round 5. And we start with the game between Praggnanandhaa, Indian superstar, and Armenian Grandmaster Levon Aronian, who moved to United States of America and now represents USA. Praggnanandhaa starts with knight f3, ready opening. d5, g3, g6, bishop develops to g2, bishop g7, d4 for Praggnanandhaa. All theory so far, c4. I'll be going quickly in the opening moves because that's all theoretical preparation by both players. They don't play here a single move that they haven't played in their life. e3, rook e8, preparing the move e5 sometime in the future. Simply h3, a5, some activity on the queen side of the board for Aronian, rook b1, a4. The pawn marches forward. Rook e1, h6, knight goes to h2, opening the diagonal for the bishop. Bishop develops to d7, knight jumps to f1, and would like to get into better squares from the square d2, and then jump maybe to e4 or c4, depending on how the game will go. Queen c8, a very tricky move because the pawn on h3 is under attack, and sometimes you don't see those type of attacks because they're so far away from the pawn. King h2, protecting that pawn, knight goes to a5, and after e4, Praggnanandhaa has a very beautiful monster pawn center that is immediately challenged by Aronian with the move c5. Exchange of the... actually, it was an exchange of the pawns because if queen would take on c5, then black would lose a piece. After bishop e3 hitting the queen, after queen will go, let's say, to b4, bishop takes b6, queen takes b6, queen takes d7. White would have an extra piece. Here, Levon Aronian plays knight c4. He will make a lot of knight moves in this game. Knight takes a4 and rook d8, putting some x-ray pressure on the queen. b4, aggressive move by Praggnanandhaa, hitting the knight on a5. Bishop b5, and that moves actually opens up the rook, and the queen is under attack now. Queen c2, knight c6, and the knight on a4 is actually very uncomfortable now. Has to move back to c3. Knight d4. The cavalry is coming for Aronian. Another knight move. Attacking the queen. Queen goes to d1. And here comes the move that is so beautiful that it's just amazing. Amazing chess by Aronian. The move is knight e2. Knight e2. He puts the knight under attack by 3 pieces. By the knight, the rook, and the queen. And apparently you cannot really take that knight with any of those pieces, because if you take it with the rook or with the knight, you just lose the queen. And if you take it with the queen on e2, then the bishop would take on c3, and black would have a much better position. Praggnanandhaa plays knight d5, blocking the rook from attacking the queen, and now we have another knight move, knight c3. Knight c3, that's a fork. if knight would take on c3, then bishop takes c3 first, and the queen and the rook are under attack. So that's not a good idea. Queen b3, and rook takes d5. Another brilliancy by Aronian. He sacrifices the rook on d5. Praggnanandhaa has 3 minutes remaining on the clock. He is under tremendous pressure on the board and on the clock. Takes the rook and queen f5. Another beautiful move. Hitting the rook on b1 all of a sudden, because the knight and the queen are attacking that rook, and hitting the pawn on f2. And Praggnanandhaa finds actually probably the best move in this position. He sacrifices the rook. He plays a rook b2, and computer also considers this a brilliant move. Protects the pawn on f2, and after knight takes b2, bishop takes b2, the engines consider this position to be even. Bishop a4 hitting the queen. Queen is pretty uncomfortable, but goes to c4. Repeat of the moves, and here comes queen f4. Again, for the second round in a row, Praggnanandhaa does not accept a draw by repetition of the moves, only with 2 minutes to go on the clock. Again, give credit to the young man. He comes to play every single game. No draws. Rook takes a2, exchange of the queens. Bishops are exchanged as well, and rook c1. We have an endgame with 2 bishops for black and 2 monster passing pawns, potentially passing pawns for white. Bishop takes b4, king g1 protecting the pawn on f2. More moves are played, more exchanges, and now we have a rook game, endgame. And this rook endgame is very drawish, 5 pawns against 5 pawns. As we know, pretty much every rook endgame with equal material is close to a draw. More moves are played. I'll go quickly here, as nothing much is happening. And after several moves, the position was repeated, and in this particular position, both players agreed to a draw. After an absolutely amazing, wonderful game, both players deserved very high marks for their performance in this game, and this is a draw. The only thing that black have to be careful here not to lose this game, and they cannot put the king on, let's say, square g6, because if they do that, they immediately get checked by the rook and promotion of the queen, and white would win the game. But as long as your king is on squares g7 or h7, that's a draw, because now if you check, then the king simply take the rook, and the rook controls the promotion square on c8. The game ended in a draw, and both players showed their class. Maxime Lagrave, legendary French chess player who didn't start this tournament really well, is playing against David Gavrilesku from Romania, whose rating is only 2506, but he is showing some good chess in this tournament. Maxime plays e4, we have Sicilian defense, knight f3, d6, Najdorf variation, one of the most popular variations, g3. g3 is the move. If you don't know much theory, if you don't want to study a lot of variations, and there are obviously tons of them in this particular opening, just play g3. Develop the bishop on g2, make a castle, and play simple chess. MVL obviously know all the theory, but he still decided to play this safe variation. e5, hitting the knight moves back, the opening moves continue, and dark square bishop is exchanged for the knight, and now white has control of the square d5. Queen d3, bishop goes back to e7, and after a long castle, white is starting to put pressure on the weak pawn on d5, because on d6, because black pretty much can never play the move d5. The square d5 is under full control of white pieces, and the pawn on d6 is a weak pawn in this type of positions pretty much for the whole game. Knight d7, f4, knight f6, f5. Gaining some territorial advantage for white. The bishop is under attack, goes back. Black's position does not look really good, but the bishop goes to c6, and now he goes to a nice diagonal, much better than it was before. g4. Maxim starts his attack on the king side of the board. h6 preventing the move g5, but h4. And now g5 is already coming. Knight d7. Queen g3, queen c7, bishop c4, more moves. Now a very nice move, rook h2. Rook h2 protects the pawn on c2. You might ask, why do you need to protect this pawn? Because nobody is even close to attacking it. But now I'll show you why. After b5, bishop goes to d5, b4. And now white would like to take the bishop on c6, and after queen takes c6, entrench their knight on a juicy square on d5. And if the rook was not on h2, they would get checkmated on c2, because there is a battery here on the c file for black. Therefore, rook h2 is a very useful move. The game continued with b4, bishop takes c6, and now Gavrilesku played a very smart move. He took the knight, not the bishop. He took the knight. Bishop has to move away. King f8. Why not castle, you might ask? Well, if you castle here for black, then white's attack is going to be even more dangerous, because the king on g8 would be actually less safe than the king on f8. So king f8 is a good move here. Exchange on d7. And b takes c3. White has an extra pawn. They're doubled. They're pretty ugly here on the king side of the board, but it's an extra pawn. And therefore it gives white some advantage. a5. Rook goes to d5. Would be nice to have a knight there on this square, but rook is good enough too. a4 hitting the knight. Knight goes to d2. The pawn on c3, by the way, is protected by the queen. Just in case you're wondering, queen a7. That's a move to nowhere, really. And g5. Rook b8. Now, if h takes g5, what happens in this case? Then still h takes g5. Rook takes h2, queen takes h2, bishop takes g5. Doesn't work, because after queen h8 check, king e7, black would lose a rook. Therefore, rook b8 is a better continuation. At least the rook is on active b file and does something there. g6, a very nice attacking move by MVL. Queen b7. Believe it or not, the best move for white here was just to activate the knight to a square c4. Because after what seemingly like a dangerous check from b1, king goes to d2, and black have nothing. They have no checks whatsoever, and white has a winning position. It was probably too dangerous for MVO. He played a more safe move, king d1. Queen entrenched, penetrated into white's position from b2, and Gavrilesku took the pawn on a2. But he's playing away from his king, and his king is in danger, and pretty much Gavrilesku doesn't pay necessary attention to it. Rook takes d6. Sacrifice of the rook. Now, computer shows that this move is a mistake. First of all, you cannot take the rook with the bishop. I mean, you can take it, but after queen takes d6, white would capture back the rook on b8 and would have a totally winning position. And the best move for black here was to take the pawn on g6, and that would give them chances to survive this game. Instead, Gavrilesku plays a3. He creates a passing pawn, which makes sense, but not in this position. King e2. The king goes to the center of the board, which is pretty amazing, and the king is very safe here, actually. King g8, rook d7 hitting the bishop, bishop goes to f6, and absolutely brilliant move, knight b3. And the move is brilliant because the queen is trapped. Nobody is attacking the queen, but the queen has no moves. So basically, black plays this position without a queen. It really cannot get anywhere into the game with this move, knight b3. Again, brilliant move by MVL. Gavrilesku plays h5, check on f7, king goes to h7, and queen f3. And now the checkmate on h5 is very difficult to stop. Gavrilesku stops it with king h6, and here comes rook g2. Rook g2, and now the threat is rook g6 check, king h7, queen h5, checkmate. Gavrilesku checks the king with queen takes c2 and resigns after a rook d2. Rook d2, the queen is under attack, and if the queen moves away to, and let's say takes the knight on b3, we have the checkmate that I just showed you. MVL, who didn't have a good start of the tournament, finally played a game that he can play. That was definitely his best game of the tournament. And possibly this would give him some strength to come back and challenge the leaders. Now I want to show you a position between Aronian, Chithambaram and Vladimir Fedoseev from the same round. This is the end game. Queen and rook against queen and rook. 2 extra pawns for black, but white is threatening the checkmate on a square g7. And a very logical move to protect yourself from this checkmate seems to be queen e5. And actually, after queen takes e5, rook takes e5, black is probably easily winning with 2 extra pawns in a rook endgame. But here, I would like you to stop the video and find an absolutely beautiful tactics that would win the game for white. And I hope you found it. And the winning move here for white is rook takes e4. And that is really beautiful because now, if queen takes e4, then checkmate on g7. And if queen takes d4, checkmate on e8. So that would be an epic ending of this game. Instead, Fedoseev obviously saw it, played a rook e5, and the game eventually ended in a draw in this position. Let's take a look at the standings after 5 rounds. They're pretty much the same as after the 4th round. Co-leaders are Firouja and Fedoseev, followed by Chithambaram. Superstars like Prag, MVL, and Duda are trailing so far, but they're not far behind. Here you can see the pairings for round 6. And if you're still here, I really appreciate it. Like, comment, subscribe. That would be great too. In round 6, most of the games ended in a draw. And I would like to show you a game between Veselin Topalov and Praggnanandhaa. Topalov starts with e4. We have Caro-Kann defense, c6. Not usually played on a high level. d4, d5, advanced variation when the pawn goes to e5. Bishop goes to f5. I'll go quickly in the opening because this is all theory and nothing much happening. f6. f6 is challenging immediately that thorn in the black position, the pawn on e5. Bishop d3, offering the exchange of the bishop. The offer is accepted. Exchange of the pawns on e5, and already on move 10, Topalov's position is just better. But this is, when you play Caro-Kann, you pretty much get yourself in a worse position for black and try to play defense. And sometimes you prevail in endgames. So the pawn on e5 controls the squares d6 and f6, not so easy to develop the knight from g8, and not so easy to actually activate the knight on d7 either. Black plays queen c7, immediately challenging the pawn on e5, and queen e2 protecting the pawn. Knight develops to e7. Knight from d4 hits the pawn on e6, and maybe not the best way to handle this position, because after queen takes e5, queen takes e5, knight takes e5, and knight e6, this position is already much easier to play for black. Knight c7 is a threat. It would be a fork, and black would lose a rook. Therefore, king d7. Pretty much the endgame already starting, so the king activates and goes to the middle of the board, which is no problem in endgames. It's actually a good thing. Some moves were repeated, and now black plays knight f5. Exchange of the minor pieces on f8, and we have an endgame that looks a little bit better for black, because they have two active knights on the squares e5 and f5, and white, if you can see, all their pieces are pretty much on the squares where they started the game. They didn't move the rook, the knight, on the bishop on the queen side of the board yet, but nothing concrete is here for black. Therefore, the ancients consider this as a very defendable position for white and consider this as an equal position. Rook e1 hitting the knight, knight goes back, rook develops to the game from the side, rook a3. Knight d4 hitting the pawn, aiming at the point on c2 and forking two rooks. Obviously, it's not allowed. Rook c3. I'll go a little quicker here. Not much is happening. Now the rook goes to h3 and trying to capture the pawn on h7. Obviously, it's protected. Black knights are jumping all over the board, but with not much of a purpose, to be honest with you. Check from e5, king goes to b6, g4 attacking the knight, knight goes to h4, another attack of the knight, knight g6, and f4. And white is getting tremendous territorial advantage with very nice pawns on f4 and g4, and according to the ancients, their position is pretty much winning. Praggnanandhaa was jumping too much with his cavalry of the knights. Knight goes to f8, more knight moves, and the position getting worse and worse. Rook e3, now the knight on e7 is under attack, so black have to play the knight move again, and now it goes to knight g8. A lot of moves by Praggnanandhaa do not make much sense, to be honest with you. I think he's not having a great tournament, but otherwise he's an absolutely phenomenal chess player and could potentially become a world champion very soon. Exchange of the pawns on d5, check from b3, and king goes to a6, and now it feels very uncomfortable there, especially after the move bishop bf2. And now the threat is real. Rook b6 check. Rook b6 check would be a real threat, winning the game. Black has to protect that square, and they do that by moving the knight to d7, but knight c4. And the threat continues. Now knight b6 is the threat, to fork two rooks. Black plays b5. Here white had a winning move that Topalov didn't find. That winning move was a very beautiful move, rook e6. Rook e6, sacrificing the knight on c4, but if you take that knight, then simply rook would take on c6, and it would be a checkmate in a couple of moves, like this. That would be a checkmate. He didn't find that nice move, but his position still remains absolutely winning. Topalov plays a takes b5 check, rook takes b5, and hitting the knight with rook d3, knight f6, and now rook e6, again targeting the pawn on c6. Here Praggnanandhaa has 13 seconds to go on the clock, and didn't manage to make the next move. He was thinking for too long, he took the pawn on g4, but his time showed zeros. And that means he technically lost the game on time. But he lost by position 2, because after rook takes c6, king b7, rook g6, his position is totally collapsing because everything is under attack, and white is winning pretty easily. The knight is under attack, the fork is coming, winning the rook, so the position is totally lost. And let's take a look at the standings after 6 rounds. We have 2 leaders, Vladimir Fedoseev representing Slovenia, Alireza Firouja representing France, and the 3rd place still belongs to a young Indian grandmaster Aravind Chithambaram. Levon Aronian, Duda, MVL, and Prague are all trailing, but they are not far behind. A lot of interesting chess is still ahead of us. Tomorrow is the last 3 rounds and the winner would be crowned. And until then, thank you for watching, hit that like button and subscribe.